6 weeks after my grandmother's funeral, I sat in a lawyer's office and learned that my parents had left me completely out of their estate plan, not just my grandmother's estate, which they'd quietly redirected years earlier, but their own future estate to the house I'd grown up in, everything, all of it earmarked for my younger brother, with a single line explaining why. Emily has always been the independent one. She doesn't need it the way Daniel does. I said almost nothing in that meeting. I drove home, sat in my car in my own driveway for 40 minutes, and made a decision I didn't share with a single person for the next 11 months. Because what my parents didn't know, what nobody in my family knew, was that 6 years earlier, quietly, legally, I had become the actual majority owner of the house they were still living in. And 11 months after that lawyer's office, I sold it out from under them. This is that story. Subscribe because it only gets more unbelievable from here. Let's get into it. My name is Emily. I'm 36. I want to start by telling you about my grandmother Rose, because understanding her matters enormously to understanding everything that happened afterward. My grandmother built a successful small chain of dry cleaning businesses over 4 decades, starting with a single storefront in her 20s, and eventually growing it into 6 locations across our region before selling the business and retiring comfortably in her 60s. She was, without exaggeration, the most financially disciplined person I've ever known, someone who understood money, not as an abstraction, but as a tool that needed to be handled with real, sustained intentionality. I was close to my grandmother in a way that, looking back, set the entire trajectory of what happened later. From the time I was in college, I'd visit her regularly, and somewhere along the way those visits evolved into something more substantial. She began teaching me deliberately and patiently how she thought about money, property, investment, and legacy. My younger brother Daniel, 4 years younger than me, was never particularly interested in these conversations. He'd politely excuse himself to watch television, while Grandma Rose and I spent hours going through her portfolio statements, her thinking on real estate, her philosophy on building generational wealth responsibly rather than simply handing it down and hoping for the best. My parents, David and Linda, had a complicated relationship with my grandmother's money throughout my entire childhood and young adulthood, not overtly contentious, but layered with a specific kind of quiet tension I only fully understood as an adult. My father, Rose's only son, had never quite lived up to what I understood to be my grandmother's expectations for him professionally. He'd worked steadily but unremarkably in mid-level management for most of his career, and I think on some level my grandmother's obvious enjoyment of our financial conversations together represented something she'd hoped for with her own son and never quite gotten. By the time I was 26, working steadily in commercial real estate, my grandmother began involving me in more concrete decisions about her estate planning, not because she'd decided to disinherit my parents, nothing that dramatic, but because she trusted my judgment on financial matters in a way that had become, over years of genuine mutual interest, simply natural between us. I want to establish something clearly here because it becomes essential later. My parents' own house, the one I grew up in, a modest but valuable property in a neighborhood that had appreciated significantly over the decades, had actually been purchased originally with substantial financial help from my grandmother back when my parents were newly married and couldn't afford it on their own. That help had come with a structure my grandmother, ever the careful businesswoman, even with family, had insisted on. Rather than a simple cash gift, she'd structured her contribution as a minority ownership stake in the property itself, a decision my father had reportedly resented quietly for years, but never seriously challenged, since without her help they wouldn't have been able to afford the house at all. Here is where the story takes its first significant turn, one that took me years to fully understand the full shape of, even though I was in a sense at the center of it the entire time. When I was 30, my grandmother, then in her early 80s and beginning to think seriously and carefully about her own estate planning in the years before her health declined, made a decision she discussed with me directly at length over several conversations. She told me plainly that she'd watched my parents' financial decisions over the decades with real concern, not cruelty, just clear-eyed assessment, and that she'd watched me, by contrast, develop exactly the kind of financial discipline and judgment she valued most. She told me she wanted to restructure her ownership stake in my parents' house, specifically transferring her minority ownership percentage to me directly rather than leaving it as part of her broader estate to be divided later. I want to be honest about my own reaction to this proposal at the time. I was hesitant. I told my grandmother I didn't want this to create conflict within the family, that I worried about what it would mean for my relationship with my parents if they learned I held any ownership stake in their own home. My grandmother, characteristically direct, told me that the arrangement wouldn't necessarily need to be widely known or discussed unless circumstances made it relevant later, that this was simply prudent estate planning on her part, ensuring the value she'd originally contributed to that property remained protected and properly documented, rather than becoming a source of confusion or dispute after she was gone. I agreed ultimately because I trusted my grandmother's judgment implicitly, and because the actual percentage involved 22% ownership stake in the property, reflecting her original financial contribution, plus appreciation, calculated carefully by her own estate attorney, felt, at the time, like a technical, largely theoretical arrangement, unlikely to ever become practically significant. The transfer was completed properly legally through her estate attorney, with full documentation, a formal deed amendment, reflecting the ownership change. My parents were informed of the transfer at the time. My grandmother insisted on that transparency, unwilling to structure anything secretly, even as she kept the broader reasoning behind her decision largely between the two of us. I remember my father's reaction when he learned of it. Confused, mildly annoyed, but ultimately accepting, framing it in his mind, I believe, as simply another instance of his mother's sometimes eccentric approach to managing her own money rather than understanding its full future significance. I want to be clear. I never once in the 6 years between that transfer and everything that happened later brought up my ownership stake, asserted any rights connected to it, or in any way used it as leverage within my family. It existed quietly as a piece of paper in a filing cabinet, technically true, but practically dormant for 6 entire years. My grandmother passed away when I was 35 after a relatively brief illness that gave our family several months to say the goodbyes we needed to say, for which I remain genuinely grateful. Her actual estate, separate from the 22% ownership stake she'd transferred to me years earlier, was distributed according to a will that split her remaining assets relatively evenly between my father and his sister, my Aunt Carol, with modest specific bequests to grandchildren, myself included, though nothing dramatic. I want to be honest that the ownership stake in my parents' house barely crossed my mind during this period. I was focused entirely on grief, on supporting my father through the loss of his own mother, on the practical logistics of a funeral, and the emotional work of saying goodbye to someone who had shaped so much of who I'd become. About 6 weeks after the funeral, my parents called a family meeting, myself, Daniel, and them, to discuss, they explained, getting our own affairs in order, inspired understandably by watching my grandmother's estate process unfold and wanting to ensure their own planning was clear and current before anything unexpected happened to either of them. I want to describe this meeting carefully because it's the moment everything shifted for me. My parents explained calmly, matter-of-factly, that they'd recently updated their own wills with an estate attorney and that the house, along with the remainder of their modest savings, would be left entirely to Daniel upon both their passing, with a specific, deliberate note explaining the reasoning. That I had always been the independent one, financially stable, self-sufficient, while Daniel, who had struggled considerably more in his career and finances over the years, needed the inheritance in a way they didn't feel I did. I sat in that meeting and said very little, processing something that felt disorienting in a way I hadn't fully anticipated. I want to be honest that the actual financial value being discussed wasn't in the abstract life-changing to me personally. I had built a genuinely stable career and didn't need an inheritance to secure my own financial future. What landed hardest wasn't the money itself. It was the specific, explicit reasoning that my own financial competence and independence, the very qualities my grandmother had spent years actively cultivating in me, had become, in my parents, framing the justification for excluding me entirely from their legacy, while Daniel's financial instability had become the reason he deserved everything. I asked carefully whether this decision had already been fully finalized with their attorney. My mother confirmed it had several weeks earlier, framing it as a settled, thoughtful decision rather than something open for further discussion. I left that meeting and drove home and sat in my own driveway for close to 40 minutes before I could bring myself to go inside, turning over again and again a fact my parents apparently either didn't remember or had decided didn't matter. That 22% of the house they'd just fully bequeathed to my brother already legally belonged to me. I want to walk through the 11 months that followed because I think the specific, deliberate nature of that period matters enormously to understanding what I eventually did and why I don't consider it to have been an impulsive act of anger despite how it might initially appear from the outside. I didn't confront my parents about the ownership stake in that first meeting or in the weeks immediately following it. I want to be honest about why, I genuinely needed time to sit with what I was feeling to separate the very real hurt of their explicit reasoning from any decision about how or whether to respond using the leverage I technically held. I spoke with an estate attorney of my own about 6 weeks after that family meeting, not my grandmother's attorney, someone entirely independent, to make sure I fully accurately understood the actual legal weight of my 22% ownership stake. She confirmed what my grandmother had explained years earlier. I was a legitimate documented co-owner of the property with real legal rights, including under certain circumstances the ability to force what's known as a partition action, a legal process that can in specific situations compel the sale of a jointly owned property, even against the wishes of the majority owners, if the co-owners cannot otherwise reach agreement on the property's disposition. I didn't move forward with anything immediately. I spent those following months doing something that surprised even me. Genuinely trying quietly to process whether I wanted to pursue any consequence at all, or whether the healthier path was simply accepting my parents' decision, processing my hurt privately, and moving forward without ever invoking rights I'd never previously exercised. What ultimately shifted my thinking over those 11 months wasn't a single dramatic moment, but an accumulation of smaller ones that revealed the deeper pattern at work. I watched over those months as my parents continued supporting Daniel financially in ways that went well beyond the eventual house inheritance, covering a security deposit on a new apartment. After he'd lost a job quietly paying off a credit card balance, he'd run up functionally, continuing a pattern I now understood with real clarity had been ongoing for years. My parents consistently treating Daniel's financial struggles as problems requiring their active intervention while treating my own financial stability not as something worth acknowledging or supporting, but as evidence that I simply required less from them going forward, in every sense including their eventual legacy. I also learned during this period something that hurt in a specific, quieter way. My mother had on more than one occasion referenced my grandmother's financial mentorship of me somewhat dismissively to extended family, framing it as Grandma Rose simply having favorites, rather than acknowledging what I understood it to actually reflect years of genuine effort and interest I'd invested in learning from a woman who had built something real from nothing. About 9 months after that initial family meeting, I made my decision. I want to be clear about what that decision actually was, because I think it's more measured than the dramatic framing of this story's title might initially suggest. I decided that I was not willing to simply remain a silent, dormant 22% owner of a property my parents had just explicitly, deliberately excluded me from inheriting, while they continued living in and benefiting from that property indefinitely. I decided I would exercise my legal rights as a co-owner formally and transparently to force a resolution, specifically a sale of the property, with proceeds distributed according to actual ownership percentages. I want to walk through the 2 months of preparation before I formally initiated anything, because the actual legal process, once begun, moved considerably faster than my parents ever anticipated, and I wanted to make sure every piece of it was handled correctly, fairly, and defensibly. I retained my estate attorney formally, and together we confirmed every detail of the original transfer documentation, from my grandmother the deed amendment, the formal appraisal that had established the 22% valuation at the time of transfer 6 years earlier, and the updated market appraisal that would be needed to establish current fair value for the eventual sale and distribution. I want to be honest about something. During this preparation period, I genuinely gave real thought to alternative paths that didn't involve forcing a sale. I considered simply requesting my parents formally buy out my ownership stake at fair market value, allowing them to remain in the house while compensating me directly for my share. My attorney and I drafted a formal letter proposing exactly this option, giving my parents 60 days to respond with a buyout offer before I would proceed with a formal partition action. I sent that letter roughly 10 months after the original family meeting through my attorney delivered formally to ensure there was no ambiguity about the seriousness of what I was proposing. I remember the specific mixture of nervousness and resolve I felt sending it, understanding fully that this letter would fundamentally, probably permanently, alter my relationship with my parents regardless of how they responded. My parents' response, when it came about 2 weeks later, wasn't what I'd hoped for, though in hindsight, I'm not sure I'd genuinely expected anything different. Rather than engaging with the buyout proposal directly, my father called me furious, accusing me of holding the house hostage, out of jealousy over the inheritance decision, insisting that my grandmother's transfer had never been meant to be taken seriously, that it was simply an old woman's eccentric paperwork that shouldn't be weaponized against her own son decades later. I told him calmly that I understood he was upset, but that the transfer had been entirely legal, fully documented, and specifically explained to me by my grandmother as intentional protective estate planning, not as he was suggesting some meaningless technicality. I told him I had given them a genuine fair opportunity to resolve this through a buyout that would have let them remain in the house, and that if they weren't willing to engage with that option seriously, I would need to proceed with my legal rights as a co-owner. The 60-day window passed without any formal buyout offer from my parents. Some further angry phone calls, an attempt through Daniel to pressure me into simply letting it go for the sake of family harmony, but no actual good faith engagement with the buyout proposal itself. At the end of that window, I instructed my attorney to formally file the petition action. I want to walk through what actually happened once the petition action was filed, because I think the procedural reality of this surprised my parents considerably given how confidently my father had initially dismissed the seriousness of my ownership stake. Petition actions, my attorney explained clearly from the outset, exist specifically to resolve exactly this kind of disagreement among co-owners of real property, and courts generally have limited discretion to simply dismiss a legitimate documented ownership claim. The law recognizes that co-owned property can't remain in permanent limbo simply because majority owners would prefer not to honor a legitimate minority stake. My parents retained their own attorney once the filing became real to them, and I understand through pieces relayed to me later by Daniel that their attorney's initial assessment wasn't encouraging for their position. The transfer documentation was clean, properly executed, and had been transparently disclosed to them at the time it occurred 6 years earlier. Their strongest available argument cantered less on disputing the validity of my ownership itself, and more on negotiating the terms and timeline of any eventual sale, along with disputing the current market valuation my attorney's appraiser had established. The process took just over 4 months from filing to final resolution, considerably faster than I'd initially braced myself for, though still a genuinely difficult stretch for our family relationships. There were 2 mediation sessions, both of which I attended alongside my attorney, where my parents' primary ask shifted from disputing my ownership entirely toward requesting an extended timeline before any sale would need to close, citing their age and the disruption of needing to relocate. I want to be honest about something. During this period, I did feel real complicated guilt watching my parents navigate the genuine practical difficulty of an unwanted court-mandated sale of the house they'd lived in for over 3 decades. I hadn't set out at the beginning of this process to cause them genuine hardship. My initial buyout proposal had been a sincere attempt to avoid exactly this outcome. But I also held firmly to the clarity I'd arrived at over those 11 months of reflection, that their explicit decision to exclude me entirely from their estate, justified by framing my own financial competence as a disqualifying factor, had created the exact situation now unfolding, and that I was not obligated to simply absorb that exclusion without exercising rights that had existed legitimately for 6 years. The court ultimately ordered the sale, granting my parents a reasonable, but not unlimited extension, 4 additional months beyond the standard timeline, to arrange alternative housing with proceeds to be distributed according to the documented ownership percentages once the sale closed. My 22% and the remaining 78% split according to my parents' own subsequent estate documentation, which notably they had to formally address during this process in ways that finally explicitly incorporated the reality of my existing ownership stake, rather than continuing to treat the house as an asset they fully controlled. The house sold roughly 8 months after I filed the petition action to a young family who I remember thinking with a strange distant clarity would likely be far happier living there than the increasingly tense atmosphere the property had held for our family during that final year. I want to describe the closing day itself because it carried a weight I hadn't fully anticipated, even after months of legal process leading up to it. I didn't attend the actual walkthrough or handoff that felt even to me like an unnecessary additional pain to inflict on my parents during an already difficult transition. But I did receive through my attorney formal confirmation of the closing and my portion of the proceeds. Just over $190,000, reflecting my 22% stake in a property that had appreciated considerably since my grandmother's original contribution decades earlier. My parents moved into a smaller condo purchased with their portion of the sale proceeds, along with existing savings, a genuinely comfortable, adequate living situation, though undeniably a significant downsize from the house they'd raised us in and had expected to remain in indefinitely. I want to be honest about the state of my relationship with my parents in the immediate aftermath of the sale, because it wasn't good. My father didn't speak to me directly for close to 5 months following the closing. My mother maintained minimal strained contact, largely focused on logistics rather than any real emotional engagement. Daniel, understandably upset about the disruption to what he'd believed was a secure future inheritance, distanced himself considerably, as well as strain in our relationship that, I'll be honest, has taken the longest of anyone in my family to begin genuinely repairing. I want to walk through where things actually stand now, roughly 2 years removed from that initial family meeting, because I think the specific unglamorous texture of the aftermath matters as much as the dramatic legal process itself. My relationship with my father began slowly to genuinely repair around the 7-month mark after the sale. Following a conversation I initiated carefully, wanting to make sure he understood something I don't think I'd fully articulated clearly during the heat of the legal process itself. That my decision to pursue the partition action hadn't been about the money in any meaningful sense, but about refusing to accept a framing where my own financial stability became the explicit justification for erasing me entirely from my family's legacy, while quietly benefiting from decades of ownership rights I never once exercised until they made that exclusion explicit and final. My father in that conversation acknowledged something that mattered enormously to me. That he understood with real clarity for what he said was the first time how deeply the specific reasoning behind their original estate decision had landed, and that he could see now how it had essentially punished me for the very qualities my grandmother had spent years cultivating in me. My relationship with my mother remains more distant though civil. She has never fully acknowledged in the way my father eventually did that the original decision was flawed in its reasoning, tending instead to focus on the disruption and hardship the partition action itself caused without fully engaging with what preceded and prompted it. My relationship with Daniel has been the slowest to repair, and I understand I don't take particular joy in how this story unfolded. I would have genuinely preferred a version where my parents engaged honestly with the buyout proposal, where we found a path that didn't require months of legal proceedings and a genuinely difficult relocation for people I love, flawed reasoning notwithstanding. But I also don't regret exercising rights that were legitimately transparently mine, rights my own grandmother had specifically structured years in advance, understanding something about our family dynamics that took me considerably longer to see as clearly as she apparently already did. If you've ever been told explicitly or implicitly that your own competence and stability make you less deserving of support, recognition, or inheritance than a sibling whose struggles have been consistently quietly rewarded, I hope this story reminds you that this reasoning, however calmly and reasonably it's delivered, deserves to be questioned rather than simply absorbed as fair. If this story resonated with you, let me know in the comments, and subscribe for more real stories about family inheritance and the long, complicated work of standing up for what's actually fair. I've got plenty more where this one came from.